Hi, I'm Chris with Afflictor Broadheads, and today we're going to talk about canning and preserving your game for long term in a pressure canner. Stay tuned. I love to pressure can. In fact, we pressure can for long-term storage anytime that we have an excess of meat. Inevitably, long-term storage in the freezer causes freezer burn after a while. And there's nothing wrong with freezing meat, so we freeze a lot of meat. Of course, all of us do as hunters. But there's another type of preservation that is delicious, it's simple, it's easy, it's long-term, and that's pressure canning. So we pressure can a lot of venison, a lot of bear. We'll even pressure can rabbits, squirrels, pheasants, turkey, anything we can get in excess. So we've pressure canned things like goose, which turns out pretty good. Goose is a tough thing, unless you really know how to cook goose, but goose pressure can turns out pretty good. We also can a lot of fish. This happens to be steelhead and lake trout mixed. Those are two pretty fishy fish, but after you can it, it tames that down a little bit. Really good for fish cakes and other things like that. And if you ever have a batch of fish that doesn't turn out and you know anybody who traps, they will love this for bait, so you'll be a hero. And then this here is bear. This is one of my favorites to can as well. For long-term storage, makes it real tender and will last a long time on the shelf. So some of the advantages of pressure canning, and the biggest advantage for me when it comes to larger game like moose, elk, bear, whitetail, is using cuts that you would normally grind, or some people even unfortunately throw out. And those are those hocks, those lower portions of muscle that have all the tendon and a lot of sinew, and maybe they have a lot of silver skin over the meat, and some people just don't like to bother with that. When it comes to pressure canning, all you have to do is remove the fat and cut that stuff up into 1-inch chunks, and basically you are good to go. It's really simple. So I'm going to talk about the pressure canners themselves real quick. We're going to talk about jars a little bit, and then we're going to go ahead and do a sample run of one jar just so you can see the process and how we do it here. You're going to see some pressure canners that only have the weighted gauge, and then you're going to see other canners that have a dial gauge on it so you can get your exact poundage. The reason that I kind of like the dial gauges is if you are at a different elevation. So if you're using a weighted gauge and you're under 1,000 feet below sea level, they will recommend you use a 10-pound weight on top of your weighted gauge canner. If you are moving up to 1,000 feet above sea level or above, they'll recommend that you use a 15 pounds. When you're looking at the actual gauge here, then you are talking about 2,000 feet below sea level and below, looking at 11 pounds of pressure that you're going to need, and above that you're looking at 12 pounds of pressure. So to be exact, the gauge will really help you be on the money. Although these are extremely accurate, I don't hesitate to use these at any time. But if you're somebody that's living up high, in the mountainous regions, and you want to be sure that you're getting the right temp when you're pressure canning, then you definitely want to look at having a gauge on your canner. So when we look at these different styles, you can see they're all kind of set up a little different. This one has one gauge and then one weighted gauge. This one has two weighted gauge and one gauge. And then this one just has one weighted gauge. One of these on here is just a fake out. This is just a pressure relief valve. The other one, of course, is your steady release. Now, how this works is as you get up to 10 pounds of pressure in here, the weighted gauge will lift. And on this style here, a few times for every minute, this will just lift up and release just enough pressure to maintain that 10 pounds in the canner. On this one, which is an oldie that I found at a garage sale and that I love a lot, this has a rocker to it. So as this gets up to 10 pounds, this gauge starts to rock back and forth. And it makes a really nice little light train track noise, and it's kind of soothing, but it lets you know that everything is doing their job, and then you can look over here at the gauge and know that you're at 10 pounds and you're exactly on the money and good to go. So very, very helpful. Now, when you're looking at canning, if you have to decide whether you want to can in quarts or pints, I like to can in quarts. I like the big jars because that seems to be enough for a meal for four for us, for our family. It's really simple and easy. So some of the things that you want to consider after you've picked a good pressure canner is your jars. Now, I do prefer wide mouth jars, but right now jars are just really hard to find. And so all I have an abundance of is these regular mouth jars, which is fine. It just makes getting the meat out just a little bit tougher at the end, but still it's so tender that there's really not much trouble doing it at all. You want to make sure when you're buying jars that you're buying a name brand jar. You want Mason, you want Ball, you want something that's name brand and heavy duty. I picked up some of these jars at the beginning of season. They're unmarked. They're a generic jar, and I pressure canned, and every one of them blew up in the pressure canner. You don't want that to happen to you. So you want to make sure that you're using a good jar. In fact, even with Ball and Mason, I found that if you use them to pressure can 2, 3, even 4 times, you will increase the chance that you will get 1 or 2 that will fracture. So what I do is I take a black Sharpie marker and I just put a little slash at the bottom every time I pressure can, and that way when it gets to 2 or 3, I retire them from the pressure canning and then maybe use them for peppers or something else. But that's a good tip so you don't fracture a jar while you're canning, because often when one goes, it takes all the surrounding ones with it, and you don't want that to happen after all this work to have your batch go bad. The other thing that's very important is your lids. When you are pressure canning, you want to make sure that you have a high quality name brand lid. And it's not that important when you're doing jellies and jams and other things to have a really high quality lid, because you're probably going to water bath to make sure that your process is finished correctly and it doesn't put crazy high heat on these seals. When you're talking about pressure canning, you're looking at temperatures of 240 to 250 degrees, and you really want to make sure you have a high seal. And it's really important because when you do pressure can and you put your lid down, you are not screwing this down really, really tight, because you want things to be, you want steam and gas to be able to escape from this jar. And if you put it on too tight, you can rupture the seal. What happens is after the process and things cool down, that seal is able to seat, vacuum, and be totally safe. One of the things that you really want to try to avoid when pressure canning is these one-piece all-purpose lids. I've tried these in several brands, several different ways, and what happens is the seal will blow out. And you can see here on the inside of this ring, this is one that had blown out for us. And if that blows out, of course, there's nothing wrong with your product, but now it's no longer shelf stable. You have to put it in your fridge. And that kind of defeats the purpose for long-term storage. Doesn't really hurt anything, but it's kind of sad, but it could make your family and friends happy if you get to give away a bunch of stuff because your seals didn't work. So anyway, avoid these one-piece style lids and go for really quality lids that have a dependable seal on them, again, like Ball and Mason and name brands. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do one jar here for you just so you can get the process down and have full understanding. The first thing I want to say is most of this meat here is from the lower legs. There's a lot of tendon in here. There's a lot of silver skin. There's a lot of meat that would normally you would have to either trim this off even before grinding, or some people, like I say, would unfortunately throw it away. When you're pressure canning, you do not have to worry about any of the tendons, silver skin, any of that tough stuff, but you do have to trim away as much fat as possible. Otherwise, the fat all comes to the surface and it really doesn't look very good. In fact, some people will say the jars of meat when they're done don't look all that palatable in the first place, and if you add fat to that, it makes them look a little bit worse. It really doesn't matter. The worst of the worst cuts you can put in here, and I promise you they will be perfectly tender. They'll fall apart with a fork, and they'll be very delicious. So what I've done is I've taken a jar here that I have washed and rinsed, and I've also boiled this jar. Now, some people will tell you that you don't need to boil your jars ahead of time when you're going into the pressure canner, but I like to boil them because it gets them up to a little bit of a temperature as you start to work this process and you put them in to the jars. They're already sterile, even though, again, it's not really necessary, but you've already heated them up, made sure that there's nothing wrong with them. It's just like another extra step for me, just in my mind, to make sure everything is 100% safe. So as you take this jar, all you're going to do is you start with your meat. Now, a lot of people love to add other things to this meat. They'll add bouillon, they'll add vegetables, they'll add garlic and all this. That is fine. But what happens in this long pressure canning process, you're going to be doing this for 90 minutes. Any vegetables that you put into this are going to turn to mush. And it's very unappetizing, even though it is quite tasty. Some people like to make a bouillon and go ahead and put that on there as well, and that's fine. Whatever suits your fancy. I recommend if you're just going to start trying this pressure canning, maybe start with some smaller jars and do a couple different things and find out what you like. Over the years, we have found that just salt is the best, because then after it's done, you can add it to whatever you want, and you can add any spices that you want, and you can put it in with fresh vegetables that are cooked to the tenderness that you desire without them being mush. Now, when you talk about doing venison and other big game, I'm a cold packer. So you take this and you pack it cool or cold into these jars after it's been salted, and you pack it down real tight. When I do small game or poultry, I like to parboil that meat just slightly, make a broth, and can that with the broth, because sometimes that meat doesn't make quite enough broth, and I like to have some extra broth if I'm making gravies or something like that. With this meat, looking as dry as it does, it is going to make its own gravy, its own broth. Just like everything that I showed you earlier when we were canning, that was all packed this way, and it has made its own broth. So again, that's why I really like just the salt method. If you're using quarts, the recommendation is 2 teaspoons of salt per quart. And that's really easy to do. You just take a measuring spoon, get your 2 teaspoons, and then what I like to do, a lot of guys will just put the meat in first and then dump your salt right on top. I like to just mix it in. Now this is all going to get mixed in naturally as you pack your jar. It really isn't a concern, but again, it's just a step that I've been used to that I like to do. You're going to go ahead after that and pack your jar. You want to get your jar about half or 3/4 full. And then you want to pack it down. Now you can use a butter knife here too to make sure you're getting any air pockets, but if you're using something like this, which is part of my grinder for running the grinder, it works really well for compacting this meat down in the jar. Take the rest of it, put a bit more in, pack it down. Finish it off with the last bits and pack it down again. You want to make sure that you're leaving about 1 inch of headspace. If you're examining this jar and you see that there's a lot of air gaps down below, again, you can just insert a butter knife down along the edges and get those air pockets out. And then you just want to make sure you've packed that down. Now, once it's packed, you're going to clean your rim. I will also boil these as well, just like with my jars, for a couple reasons. It softens up that, but again, for me, I'm so mental about the sterility process, and all my other canning, it's just a force of habit. Some people will tell you that it's not even necessary to boil your lids for this, but I like to do it anyway. Go ahead and put that down, and here is something that's important. When you put this lid on here, you do not want to super tighten it down. You don't want to reef on it at all. So when I get this down to where it stops, I just give it just a little bit of a turn just so it's lightly seated. Again, you want things to be able to escape. As this is cooking, you want that gas to be able to get out of there and for it to be able to cook, because as this is cooking, this will actually be boiling in here as it's going through the pressure canning process. And if you were to open up your pressure canner early after cooling, even a couple hours, this stuff will still be boiling in here, and that's got to have some place to go. So you want to make sure you do that. When you have this in your pressure canner and you've gone through your 90 minutes at 10 pounds and you're done, you're going to want to turn your pressure canner off and leave it go. You want it to cool down completely naturally. Force cooling it could cause problems with your seal or your lid and other issues. It can actually also cause warping with the lid of your pressure canner. So you don't want to force cool it at all, where I know some recipes call for force cooling. When you're canning meat, fish, or anything else, do not force cool. Let it come back to room temperature on its own. And then you're ready to remove it, wipe it off, label it, and put it on a shelf or eat it fresh. All right, so we're going to just take our jar here and put it in the pressure canner. And normally in here in my rack, I will have this completely full, so there's not much room for things to shuffle around and move in the process. Then I'm going to remove my weighted gauge, and I'm going to lock my lid on. I'm going to leave the weighted gauge off of the vent until it is producing a steady stream of steam coming out of this hole. And the reason is that you want to eliminate any of the air that's in here. It has to be completely filled with steam. And so once that steam starts coming out of here in a steady state, I will still give it 5 to 10 minutes. That may make sure that everything in here is regulated, and I'll go ahead then and put my weighted gauge on there, verify that I'm coming up to 10 pounds before I start rocking. Then I can basically set my timer at that point for 90 minutes. Something that's very important: if at any time your gauge drops below 10 pounds, let's say you have an electric stove, the electric goes out, or something happens to where you have lost your pressure, you don't have to change anything in here, but you do have to start your timer from scratch. So the moment that happens, you got to start all over again, hit it for 90 minutes, and you'll be good to go. And that's a great way to make sure that you're safe. So we're going to leave this off here, let it come to temperature, and be back with the next step. Now the second I put that gauge on, the needle will start moving on this gauge, and it'll get up to 10 pounds before we start rocking. In the first part of this process, you can really crank your heat up on high, get that all boiling in there, get your steam coming out in a nice steady stream, and even when you're trying to get it up to temp. But as it gets close to 10 pounds, you're going to want to start backing your heat off a little bit, and as soon as you get your rocking, you're going to want to back your heat off as much as you can. So this is the only part of the process where you have to maybe play with your heat just a little bit to get it right, so you have a nice steady rock and you're maintaining your pressure. When you're putting your water in your pressure canner, you want your water level to be, I think most recommendations are 2 to 3 inches. However, when I'm doing meat or fish and I have a longer time of cook, I like to put more than that in there. So I'm up to 4 to 5 inches because I don't want to worry about having anything change here during that 90 minutes. So it's a good idea to go ahead and give yourself a little bit more water. It won't hurt anything in the pressure canner because your pressure is still going to be the same, and you're still going to be at that 240 to 250 temp. All right, so we've hit just above 10 here, which is 11 pounds, and our rocker is just starting to slightly rock. You can hear it just starting to take off. Got that nice gentle rock to it. And here's where you can start to slow down your heat. So I got that nice gentle rock, just like that is perfect. If your weighted gauge is going nuts, then you've got too much heat down here, so you need to back it off a little bit. You want to babysit it at this time too for just a while to make sure everything's working good. And you'll find that once you get this up to temperature and your gauge is rocking good, that you really you don't have to have much heat down here. It really doesn't take much. Regulating really good. I have a nice steady rock, nothing's going crazy. I'll watch this just for a couple minutes to verify that everything's good, and then I'm going to go ahead and set my timer for 90 minutes and just let it go. Alright, so our needle has gone down to 0 on our dial. Our little safety button back here is collapsed. There is a little bit of steam coming out here, and we have sped up this process a little bit just to be able to show you everything. So instead of force cooling with cold water, I just removed the weighted gauge and we went ahead and let all the steam come out. But I will show you, which is really interesting, is when you open this up and you pull out your jar, since we're talking about these pressures now, I got to be very careful what I'm doing here, but I'm going to lift this up and show you how that is still cooking and boiling really crazy in that jar. This is the reason you can't screw that lid down really, really tight, because you are going to screw up your seal. At this point, it is very important that you don't disrupt your jar. You want to, like I said, you want to leave this lid on there, leave it all sealed, let this come to room temperature on its own before you pull any of this out. You don't want to disturb anything that's going on here, but you can see how strong that cooking process is inside the jar. So at this stage, after this is completely cooled and is ready to go, you can eat it right away, or you can put it on the shelf. It has a storage life of over a year. If you're really curious, you can do some research and get some time frames on that you really feel secure about. But it's a great, easy way to utilize game when you have an excess of it, or you want to get rid of cuts that may not be your favorite.